let's start about this guy. So, as you've heard, Ross grew up in Montevideo, Minnesota, with his two brothers and his mom and dad, Dave and Tyke. Dave and Tyke are really an extended set of parents for me, because across the street from Briggers lived the Ward family. The Ward family consisted of Kay and Mark and three girls, Rebecca, Sharon, and Pam. Well, it turns out all three Brigger boys lined up perfectly with all three Ward girls. So Pam and Ross met each other in kindergarten. They went through elementary school together, they went through middle school together, high school together, and they stayed in touch. While Ross was at West Point, she went to Baylor. And years later, Ross and I were, not only did we meet at West Point, not only were we Army roommates together at Fort Polk, Louisiana, but Ross introduced me to Pam. So 3 years later, Pam and I married. So, safe to say, Ross's family's really been part of my family for over 30 years. And because of the connection with my wife, Pam, I've really known Ross since he was in kindergarten. There's been plenty of memories of going with Dave and Tyke to the casinos in Montevideo. Dave and Tyke would win all the money, and Ross and I would lose, but we pretended we actually kind of sorted it okay. But so Ross and I, we've known each other for an awful long time. We met at West Point, as I said, about 5 years together as roommates in the Army on and off. And we continued to stay in touch through the years. There was a special connection there, both by the fact that I married one of his best friends and across the street neighbor. When he was diagnosed with cancer, I was there for him. We actually flew out to Hawaii and we spent a long weekend together, just having the opportunity to chat with him before the surgery. And we're together all the way down to the end here. The last couple months for Ross were very difficult. We would talk every 2 to 3 days, sometimes 4 days, but we were there for each other. And I can just tell you, in the final months, or in our final phone call, the subject we talked a little bit about Ben, kind of expectations, what Ross was wanted that relationship to be and what he wanted to do. And we closed the call with me telling Ross that I loved him, and none of that, I love your brother, or I love you, man, or any of that. It's I love you, Ross. And he closed it back with that he loved me back. And that was the relationship we had. I've been very blessed to have known Ross. And my hope today is I can share a few memories with you that can hopefully provide some respect for just what that relationship meant to me and what Ross really was all about. So the first thing I can tell you is, man, that dude was as cool as the other side of the pillowcase. And I'm not kidding. He was assigned to A1. So A1 at West Point is and I'll have a couple of other West Pointers that might argue this point, but A1 was the toughest. It was the hardest place to be. If you were a plebe and you were assigned to A1, it was one of those things where you kind of cringed because you knew the discipline was harder. You knew the inspections were going to be harder. You knew there was going to be extra work that you had to do. All this additional stress that was going to be placed on you. And oh, by the way, you still had to do 21 course hours at school. And oh, by the way, intramurals are mandatory. And all meals, you have to form up in formation, and those are mandatory. And all the marching exercises are mandatory. And you've got this incredible stress of being in A1. It's hard to say the least. But then we had Ross. And Ross would be the guy that'd be out in formation, and the upperclassmen would get in his face 3 inches away, screaming at him to wipe the smirk off his face. He wasn't smiling, he was just always happy. But that was Ross. I mean, he was always calm under pressure, calm under fire. At West Point, you have what's called a salmon inspection, which is Saturday morning inspection. It's one of the toughest things you do as a plebe, because really it's a haze tool. It's impossible to pass. You can't have any dust in your room. You can't have dust, on the bed frames. You can't have dust above your mirror. You can't have dust above the hanging lights that are 14 feet up in the air. All your drawers have to be open. All your socks have to be rolled appropriately. Your underwear's got to be folded perfectly. Your t-shirts are folded. Everything in your closet has to be hung up and wide open for inspection so that every hanger is evenly laid out. The angles of the hangers have to be perfectly measured. It's a very, very difficult time to to pass. And so my roommate for the first semester of the year was Doug Moon, who's actually going to be following me. And let's just say Doug and I weren't exactly that organized sometimes. Maybe we were a little sloppy, maybe we were a little disheveled compared to some other folks. But the number of times that we'd be just sweating it out, freaking out, trying to get everything done on Saturday morning before this inspection actually started, and Ross would just come, pinging into our room, big smile on his face, "Hey guys, what's going on?" And it's just like, "Dude, are you serious? We got an inspection in 30 minutes. What are we doing here? What can I do to help?" And that was the guy. He was just constantly cool under pressure. The goal at West Point is really to kind of break you down. Because people like Ross show up at West Point, and Ross was a stud. He had the academics, athleticism. Cross-country running, I still hate the fact that he used to smoke me all the time in running. And he had the leadership capabilities. He was his class president. So people like Ross come to West Point. What West Point really wants to do is they want to kind of drop you down that notch so they can teach you the appropriate way to truly be a leader and lead people in this country. And Ross ate it up. There was no intimidation on his part. There was no concern about, freaking out under fire or anything else. He just loved being part of that environment. Everyone breaks down. It leads to funny stories. For myself, my breakdown came one day when somebody didn't deliver laundry, which was a plead duty, and I threatened to throw him through a closet. Not a good moment. We all had that moment, right? We all have the story as plebes at West Point, where we had that, where we just kind of lost it, and, hit bottom, but then you start coming back up on it. I emailed all my classmates from A1, so 30 cadets, new cadets, started West Point together. I couldn't find anybody to share with me a single story where it would be Ross losing it. Every email was about, he always had a smile on his face. He always had a welcome ear to lend. Somebody needed some help. Somebody needed somebody to talk to. Somebody to listen to him. He was always there for everybody. Again, not a single person could share with me that one case where, boy, he just completely spazzed out, really made an embarrassment out of himself. Because he was cool. He was always calm under pressure. When I was talking to him the last couple of months here, we set up a goal that we're going to run a 5K together. There's a long story behind it, we don't get into all that, but we decided, from a recovery, getting physical therapy, starting to walk again, let's set this as a goal. We'll run it, or we'll walk it, we'll do whatever, but we're going to run a 5K together. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do that with him in the next year. But it was funny because I actually hated running with Ross. And I'd do just about anything I could right now to have more opportunity with him. But again, it was because Ross would pass you running, and he'd just have this big smile on his face. And he'd be like, "Hey, how you doing, Jim? You can do it. Come on, keep going, keep going." Unfortunately, he'd already hit the turnaround point, was coming back, and I was saying, "No." That's who he was. Like I said, he was as cool as the other side of the building. The other thing I'd like to share with you about Ross is he selflessly served his friends in his country. What does it mean to selflessly serve? If you really think about this, it's a challenge that I'm willing to bet the majority of us would have a difficult time meeting. I read a book probably about a year and a half ago that talked about marriage and relationships and what it means to have an unbreakable marriage. It talked about selfless service to your spouse. And I kind of use that as my approach with my wife, that I try to selflessly serve her. And I got to tell you, I fail almost once a day. It's so hard to be a selfless servant for anything, to have the right mindset and everything else. But that was Ross. And it's uncanny, and to a degree, it's almost unbelievable. He was a field artillery officer, and that's what he wanted to be. And he selflessly served his soldiers, his peers, and the United States Army and his country. That was Ross. That's all he wanted to do. When I would see all of his, so we were roommates at Fort Polk, we were roommates at Fort Hood. He would have all the field artillery lieutenants show up at our house, and sorry, don't listen to this, but we would play poker. Right? And it wasn't about, gambling and winning and all Ross is more about the fact that he wanted to provide the social opportunities to bring some of the newer lieutenants in that didn't know everybody, and I mean, that was Ross. He set that up for others in order to help them get ingrained into their unit. He also had a bunch of lieutenants, and they went out and got tattoos. So Ross has a tattoo, and I remember the morning he showed me, it was a Saturday morning, and he's like, hey, look what we did last night. He showed me his scorpion tattoo, and this is the only time this has ever crossed my lips since I've been alive, but that's the first time I ever said, well, I'm glad I had duty on Friday night. Otherwise, I guarantee you I would have had one as well. But Ross would always get good jobs. He was always, always got the great locations for assignments and everything else. I mean, he was solid. Again, this was his passion. This is what he wanted out of life. And he's very successful at it because he selflessly served. Whether, again, it's his soldiers, whether it's his unit, in his country. And I've got to tell you, as a friend, I don't think there's anybody else more qualified than me to talk about his selfless nature. Number one, he's an idiot for introducing me to his across the street neighbor, who is just absolutely beautiful and wonderful woman, and has been my wife for over 20 years now. But he made that mistake, and I took advantage of it. But really, I'll share with you just one long, not too long, last story about our relationship and living together. But I was selected to deploy to Kuwait, and back then we didn't have all the electronic tools that you have now, right? Bill paying, email access, cell phones, right? So when you deployed, it was kind of like you were deploying and you were going. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I pay all my bills? How do I get, I got credit card debt, I've got the rent to pay, I've got this, that, and the other thing. And our boss is like, well, why don't you sign a checkbook or two and I'll just take care of it for you. How many of us in this room would really sign 2 complete checkbooks and just hand them to somebody? But that was the guy Ross was. So I signed 2 complete checkbooks, said, here you go. And I never had to worry about it. When I came back from Kuwait, I was debt free. How selfless is that? We're also talking, this is probably about 3 weeks before I deployed, I had a motorcycle. And so I had to find a place to store the motorcycle. And I was going to be gone for a while. And I was trying to figure out that and everything. And sure enough, there's Ross, and he's like, let's just put it in the living room. You want me to put my motorcycle in the living room for the next 4 or 5 months? Yeah, it won't bother me. All right. Talk about selfless. All right, so he looked at my motorcycle for 5 minutes. And I would just tell you, I think I was a good friend of Ross, but nothing compared to the friendship that he's displayed and shared with me. And for that, I'll forever be grateful. So I have to tell you, I had multiple myeloma. I was diagnosed about a year ago, just as Ross. Ross had cancer. So multiple myeloma is not the kind of cancer you want. It's a blood cancer. It's a deadly blood cancer. There's no cure for it. I've gone through an awful lot of treatment over the last year, and I just had my last chemo on Wednesday. And I'll take chemo the rest of my life every 2 weeks till it comes back again. And the end of life story for people with multiple myeloma is not a good story. You basically, when it's your time, it's a very let's just call it very painful ending. That's highly medicated, and you're pretty much in bed. But it's one of those things where you can sit around and worry about it. But for me, I don't really worry about it because I know in my life the most difficult things, the hard things, they'll never be the last thing. In the book, Why Making Sense of God's Will, Adam Hamilton used a quote there, and it said, resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. And that's what I believe. So end of life for me is not something I really dwell on too much. And I know Ross was in a lot of pain over the last couple of years, but I know he still tried to get to church. I know Ross is a believer. Again, I've lived with the guy long enough to know that he was. And it was, in Adam's book, as I was reading through this, the Apostle Paul wrote, for I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Paul could say that because he knew that none of these things would be the last thing. No matter the struggle, no matter the pain, no matter the conflict, God always has the final word, and the final word is resurrection. Resurrection means that the worst thing Ross had to deal with will not be the last. Be thou at peace, Ross Brigger.